Thank you, and thanks for INSU for having me. First, I want to acknowledge my two co-authors, Dr. Thomas Kerr and Dr. Andrew Ivsins. I'm just a community-based researcher, and I have a lot of love and respect for these two men, and especially after dealing with my nonsense for the last couple of years. So, they really took me under their wings. So we did a study, a qualitative study on motives on why people have transitioned from injecting to smoking in Vancouver, British Columbia. It was funded through the BC-CSU, and both my co-authors have appointments at UBC. I have a couple of disclosures to announce. I got personal and fees from AbbVie and grant and personal fees from Gilead. I'm also on the INSU board, and I've smoked drugs on and off most of my adult life, and I think that's important to the context of this. And Thomas Kerr and Andrew Ivsins have no disclosures to report. So first, I'd just like to acknowledge that the work of this research project was done by people across the indigenous lands, which is now referred to as Canada. The research study itself was conducted on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. But I'm on the other side of what we now call Canada. I'm on the East Coast, and I did a lot of the development and analysis and written portion of the project in the unceded and traditional land of the Mi'kmaq. So, just a little bit of context of, why people have been transitioning from injecting or just changing their mode of consumption. This is a paper that was published earlier this year by George Karandinos and Dan Ciccarone and colleagues, and they looked at SAMHSA health admissions data from 2000 to 2021, so 21 years of data, but they looked specifically at heroin consumption, and what they found was there was a decrease in injection nationally, increase in smoking, particularly in the western U.S., and an increase in snorting in the eastern U.S., and that's very similar to what we are finding and what we're seeing in Canada. So how do people smoke drugs? People smoke drugs a wide variety of ways. If you've caught Magdalena Harris's presentation yesterday, a lot of times people, just because they don't have a safe using pipe doesn't mean they're not going to smoke their drugs, right? So a lot of people use water bongs. Maybe it's a makeshift water bong with a little bit of ash on top and a pipe in it. Maybe they go and buy a nice water bong. And people smoke crack a lot this way. Tin foil is being used more and more to smoke down. Tin foil and like a straw or a pipe, and you just heat it up underneath it. And but I think the most common mode of crack consumption, or how people typically smoke crack, is through a crack pipe and Brillo or screens. But there's a wide variety of ways that people smoke drugs. So a little bit of background on the study, why we did this study. People who use unregulated drugs have been transitioning from injecting to smoking their drugs, or at the very least injecting and smoking their drugs, and this study is exploring why this is happening. And it's important to note that it has happened in tandem with this evolving and escalating toxic drug supply, and which we see a lot of increasing kind of stimulant, fentanyl, polysubstance use, usually meth and fentanyl substance use. It's really important to note in British Columbia, Canada, the primary mode of overdose deaths is from smoking drugs right now. And this seemed to happen in other West Coast cities in North America. And this shift is a more recent shift that happened primarily after the COVID-19 pandemic. So what did we do? I actually flew out to Vancouver to conduct a lot of these interviews myself. I did a couple with Dr. Andrew Ivsins, and then I did a lot on my own, and Andrew Ivsins did a lot on his own as well. But we conducted 31 in-depth semi-structured qualitative interviews from February to March 2023 with people who have smoked drugs in the last 31 days. We recruited people from 2 large cohorts in BC, including VIDES and Access, but we also did a lot of recruitment through the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Using People, which is North America's first drug using organization, and it operates an overdose prevention site and an informal safe inhalation site, and we did a lot of our interviews actually at VANDU's headquarters, but we also used the BCCSU's qualitative interview head office, which are both located in the downtown east side. So the data analysis was guided by your typical Braun and Clark thematic analysis to look for patterns in the meaning of the data set. Myself and Andrew Ivsins, the senior author, met over a couple months to analyze and develop the focus for this manuscript. And like I said, I can't thank him enough for, just putting up with me and my chaotic life. And, I'm not a student of UBC or anything, but I'm very much a student of Thomas and Andrew. And so we met online over a couple months. I thought I had to have this all done, the first time we met, and they're like, "You're crazy. Why would you think that?" And but it has really shaped into something quite beautiful, which is almost ready to be published. So we captured all codes related to drug smoking, positive and negative, and then we identified a couple of themes which we'll speak to in the results section. So we always collect a lot of demographics. Here's just a couple that are important. So out of the 31 people, we had 20 men, 10 women, 1 person who identified as other, even though we did have options for non-binary and trans. The housing accommodations, nobody had their own house. 10 people were in an apartment, 6 people were in a privately owned SRO, which is a single room occupancy hotel. 7 people were in a publicly owned one. 1 person at a shelter, 2 person at a friend's place, 2 people unsheltered or living rough outside, and 3 just identified others. And then their modes of consumption, which I think is really important. Everyone had to smoke drugs in the 31 days. 15 people injected drugs in the past 30 days, but that means more than half did not inject drugs in the past 30 days, and I think that's really important to highlight. So the results, what did we find? So almost all participants had a history of drug injecting, and when discussing reasons for transitioning to smoking drugs, participants who previously injected drugs spoke about this difficulty of injecting, such as losing your ability of finding veins. And these 2 short quotes, I think, sum up it really smoothly. Like, it's because you can't find my veins anymore. I've killed all my veins. I used to inject drugs. I don't shoot anymore because I have no veins left, and I can certainly relate to those 2 quotes. And I think, it's a lot of people say, I just had to realize, or one person said, I just had to realize that I just can't inject anymore. It's just not physically possible. So yeah, I have no choice. And that's the only reason why I think a lot of people stop injecting. Our second theme was control with consumption. So there was a lot of discussion of control and how it was related to one's health, but also just around their drug use in general. A lot of participants also believe that there is a less chance of overdosing by smoking drugs, which is really interesting because we know most overdoses in BC are happening by smoking drugs. So this is a quote. It says, while they believe by smoking that you can just put a little less on the tinfoil so they're not getting as much of the fentanyl. It would take 3 dragons compared to 1 shot for them to OD, right? And, I think that's important, but, I think we need to do some, good knowledge translation that you can overdose from smoking. And then, a lot of people just talked about control over how much they consumed by smoking instead of injecting. this is one of my favorite quotes of the data set. I use a lot less, so that's a plus, and not feeling a need to get more because I'm getting dope sick. You know, like I said, it lasts a bit longer, but when you're smoking it, it lasts a bit longer when you're smoking it, right? More bang for your buck. And then our third theme was accessibility. And, you know, so the idea that smoking drugs was a lot more accessible than other modes of consumption was an important theme. And, you know, people want to be able to smoke their drugs or use their drugs in the easiest and most effective way possible. Smoking drugs, it's more easier. You can just put it in a pipe and puff away. You know, the thing with injecting is it's like a hassle also too, right? I mean, smoking, it's pretty easy. So I think, you know, that ties up our three themes together nicely. So the discussion section, you know, I think it's really interesting and important to highlight that this has been happening in tandem with the evolving toxic drug supply. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that has to be used much more frequently than heroin, which we believe is the reason why most people are now having difficulty with injecting. You know, you used to be able to use heroin a couple times a day, but if you have to inject 10, 15 times a day, you're going to have issues with your vein. The same is true around the control for consumption theme. People have adapted to this toxic drug supply by choosing to smoke their drugs rather than inject them to get more for their money. This ties into structural vulnerability and people living in poverty and not being able to afford all the drugs they want to consume. Additionally, with the accessibility theme, if smoking drugs is easier and more accessible and people must use fentanyl more frequently, then accessibility becomes a huge reason that ties our three themes together. So I can't highlight this enough. You know, like this is happening in North America's drug supply, which is a synthetic drug supply. But, you know, I believe that the synthetic drug market is here to stay and will likely happen across the world. Canada has had very liberal drug policies, but that's most likely due to change with our next federal election. I think it's important to note some of the pioneers in this field. So Prairie Harm Reduction in Saskatchewan opened the first CDSA exempt safe inhalation site with absolutely zero provincial government funding or support. This shows it can be done with or without support or funding, but other services have opened safe inhalation sites or started to informally provide these services, but we still need more supervised consumption services to offer inhalation services, especially with this increase in drug smoking. And we need to expand equipment for using materials to include a variety of ways for people to smoke their drugs, such as tinfoil, bubble pipes, and water bongs. This is the Cadillac model of supervised inhalation sites, and you know, like this is what we need. And this is at the Prairie Harm Reduction model. They have ventilation, but they did this and they've been operating it for 4 years with no government support or no government funding. We are going to dark times in Canada, but I think, you know, like these leaders show like we don't need the government's approval to do this. Well, we may need their approval, but you know, these guys can do it with no funding, no support, and do it with the Cadillac model. In BC, they're about to open a couple first indoor supervised inhalation rooms. So this is at the BC Centre of Excellence in HIV/AIDS. It'll be interesting to see what happens with the upcoming BC election to see if will still be a thing. And as we know, people, if they don't have safe using supplies, they will just make their own bottles and makeshift models to smoke their drugs. So in a criminalized, you know, in the UK where it's illegal to give out safe using supplies, people will just make them. But in BC, in contrast, in Canada, we have methods and ways to just order as many glass stems and meth pipes as possible through the BC CDC, which I think is a way that we need to move forward for the rest of the country, or rest of the world. Katie has this great guide sheets, 7 tips to how to smoke drugs with tinfoil. and they highlight what harm reduction supplies you need to do that. There's just a couple policy implications that come along with the increase in drug smoking. We need to adapt our supervised consumption services to include inhalation through proper ventilation, or at least allow people to smoke outdoors with naloxone on hand. All supervised consumption services should offer a variety of methods to consume drugs. This should be kept in mind in places like the United States, where overdose prevention centers are a newer thing. We need to make sure we have options for people to smoke. And I never talked about safer supply, because we've had a lot of talk about it at this conference, but when we're looking at people smoking drugs and moving into this territory of safer supply, we need to look at safer supply models that are available to smokes. For example, you can smoke a fentanyl patch if provided with less restrictions. And yes, I just want to thank INSU for accepting our abstract and for having me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Although we've run out a little bit out of time, you didn't run out of time, so that's why I want to allow 1 or 2 questions if you agree with that. Are there any questions for Matt? Yes, please, here in the front. I have a question in the meantime,
Okay.
because I think in general we see the transition of injecting to smoking as a harm reduction intervention, but you noted the increased overdose death through smoking. So if you have anything to say about that and how to message that.
Yeah, I think it's really important on how we moving forward, how we kind of talk about smoking drugs, right? Like, you never use alone. You know, a lot of people may be in encampments or using outside, and our community keeps us safe, right? So the interesting thing is, people who smoke drugs tend to smoke drugs together. It's more of a social aspect compared to injecting, where you may be alone in a room. But yeah, I think, you know, if somebody's using, you know, have multiple vials of naloxone on hand, you know, like, and responding to smoking overdose is a bit unique. You know, they don't go down as quickly, from my experience, they don't go down as quickly as they do from injecting. So you can't just, if you're smoking with someone, just let them smoke, give them a little bit of time, make sure they're okay, then smoke, you know? So I think, yeah, we have to get creative with our harm reduction messaging around smoking.
Great job, Matt. Mohan Karamuzin from University of Toronto. I think my question is about whether you saw any gender dynamics in your findings, given that we know assisted injection and shared injection is pretty gendered. Did you notice that any of that in your data, in your interviews?
You know, that's really interesting, and just to see what's happening in the UK with the gender dynamics around smoking. I don't think we've seen anything particularly, but you know, it's maybe worth looking back into the data set to see if we can pull like a gender analysis or something.